I have to say that I'm a little bit not intimidated, but a little bit curious to see how well this goes. And the reason I say that is because I've never really taught a class on poetry. And that's what we're really going to look at is the poetry of Mary Oliver. We've kind of been through this before that the saints that we're focusing on, saints of our time, is really the people that are producing literature of some sort. And so that lets us have access to them. So that's why Mary Oliver made the cut. And I think unlike with Buechner and Barbara Brown Taylor, preachers don't often quote poets. Now they did 100 years ago and back before that, poets were quoted very regularly in sermons, and that wasn't just the stereotypical joke about 3 points in a poem, although that was true, but poets were quoted, not necessarily whole poems, but lines of poets were quoted. But unlike that, preachers don't quote poets, although among the preachers I know, there are quite a few who have a fondness for poetry of Mary Oliver. And I think unlike with Buechner and Barbara Brown Taylor, scholars and laity alike don't often read poetry, although probably she is the best known contemporary poet. And I'm using contemporary in the sense that recent. So what do you know about her story? What have you heard or read by her? Anybody want to unmute and tell us what you know or have read?
She loves nature, and she loves the mystery of the universe, writes a lot about the mysteries that we don't really know the answers to, and nature, and just in a beautiful way. I'm not much of a poet person, but I really enjoy her.
Good.
I've read a bit of her, and one of my favorite is Blue Horses. That just brings me to tears, that one. And she loved her dog Percy so much, and I have love affairs with pets, and that one brings me to tears. And then I recently got Devotions. It's highlights from all of her books. It's so fantastic, and I think we all love When Death Comes, the line in that. So she just moves me. I'm really grateful for her and that you're talking about her tonight.
Yeah, happy to do it. Anyone else?
Also, I believe she was in a lesbian relationship, maybe?
She was lifelong. Yeah, I'll do a brief overview of her life here in a minute. Okay, well, I wouldn't expect a whole lot more than that because, like I said, we're not, as a country, really into poets much. So here is just the briefest overview of her life. She was born in 1935. She died 2 years ago. I think it was in the fall, so it'll be 2 years this fall. She was a very private person. And so even if you were to try to scrounge up every little scrap of biography you could, you wouldn't find much. She was born in Ohio, semi-rural suburb of Cleveland, and that semi-rural part's important because, as you heard, nature is a really important thing to her. Her home life was very dysfunctional, including sexual abuse. She doesn't chronicle the details of that anywhere, but she has confessed to that. But she said that she always found refuge in nature. She considered it an extended family of sorts. She began writing poetry at the age of 14. And at 17, she visited the home of the late poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, becoming friends with Edna's sister and spending 7 years organizing her papers. So you can imagine, as a budding poet, to be able to just handle those papers and to get to hear stories about, about Edna and poetry, that was really important to her. And it was while she was working on those papers, it was up in New York, actually, that she met her lifelong partner, who was a photographer, Molly Malone Cook. And she studied at Ohio State and Vassar, but she didn't graduate from either one. And here's why. In public school as well as college, she often skipped classes to wander in nature and write poems. So she really was a poet in the truest sense of the word. She published her first collection, No Voyage and Other Poems, in 1963. She taught at several universities because poetry does not pay, but she taught in several schools, including Bucknell and Bennington College. Bennington's kind of famous because Kathleen Norris taught there as well, if you know that writer. And then in 84, even though she didn't graduate from college, and even though she skipped school a lot, she won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. So those of you who graduated, that's why you didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. You went to class instead of writing poetry. In 92, she won the National Book Award for new and selected poems. So as poets go, she's about as decorated as they get. I mean, a Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. So here's what I want to say that I kind of hinted at a minute ago. These are two Greek words. So the earliest Christian communities, think the first 200-300 years of the Christian movement, they were formed internally, that's a key phrase there, by didaskalia, that is by teaching. They taught. But those communities were defined externally by apologia, that is by defense of their teachings. So almost all of the early church writings, majority of them, are defense of the faith to the critics, especially in the Roman Empire. And I'm bringing this up to say that normally what we do on Monday nights is we just do teaching. I just teach you about whatever it is. But this to me seems like an occasion for an apologia because we're focusing on our poetry, and most of us don't read poetry, or we're intimidated by poetry, or we're allergic to poetry, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a defense of poetry, which might seem kind of useless because you tuned in, right? But maybe you tuned in out of habit. So I'm going to give a little bit of defense. So here's my brief apologia. I often, and my students will tell you this, I often began preaching class by reading a poem as devotional thought. And of course, Mary Oliver would have been probably the most quoted. And yet every time I did it, it felt totally futile. I mean, even while I was reading, I could feel people going, why in the world is this old guy reading poems to us? Even though I enjoyed it. I then would try to tell them, okay, think about this. Poets speak in pictures, not abstractions. And poets are wordsmiths, paying attention to rhythm and beauty. And poets slow us down, they make us think. And then I would say, and all of those are good qualities for people going into ministry. But honestly, I think they're good qualities for anybody who's Christian. The Christian faith is not an abstraction. I mean, we use abstractions, words like the incarnation, right? That means the fleshliness of Jesus. But the Bible doesn't say incarnation. The Bible says he went to a big wedding and turned water into wine. So the Bible speaks more in pictures. And I think, paying attention to rhythm and beauty is just a spiritual devotion. And of course, slowing us down to make us think. My gosh, how many of us could use that? Another apologia. Let's face it, that STEM classes are winning out over courses in humanities. In fact, there's a lot of literature right now about humanities courses being cut. This is one of my favorite stores. It's the Grolier Poetry Bookshop. It's across the street from Harvard, but that is the entire shop. It's a little bit bigger than a phone booth, but not a lot. And they can't even fill those shelves, right? You see the empty ones, but you can go in there if you ever go. There's around the corner, there's a regular bookstore, and it's full of people. This is about the most you'll ever see in the Grolier Poetry Book. bookstore. All right, another Apologia. This is a fascinating book, by the way, and maybe Bob Moffat would want to pick it up and read it. The first half pretty much requires, if not a medical degree, an undergrad degree in biology or something. It's about brain research, and it's very, very deep. But the second half is written for still a learned, population, but he wants to trace, as you can see there in the subtitle, the making of the Western world. So he traces this left brain, right brain thing throughout history in the West. And for the most part, what he says is, and I'm using left brain, right brain here to contrast prose and poetry. So for those of us who say, I don't know about poetry, well, that's a left brain comment. Poetry happens in the right brain, but he documents how ideas that originate on either side are checked by the other. So if you have a creative idea, the left brain is going to check it. And if you have a very what word am I looking for? A very logical kind of idea, the right brain might play with it. But he says in the West, the left brain has almost always had the final word. So in a way, the West has just been influenced by this kind of left brain thinking, which is not poetic. So there is, in some ways, brain evidence that we're not very much poetic anymore, even though there were cultures and times where we were. And then also, I think people be surprised, maybe shocked at the poetry that's on nearly every page of the Bible. You could even say it really is on every page. So if you ask people to name the poetry of the Bible, they'll say, well, the Psalms, maybe some people would say Proverbs, although that's more proverbial, Job, Ecclesiastes, and that's kind of Song of Solomon, and they would say that's the end of it. But the truth is that Genesis and Exodus and the letters of Paul and every one of them, they have poetry built in. It's there sometimes in rhyme, sometimes in all kinds of little literary devices, and sometimes in meter. Unfortunately, publishers don't very often format it or translate it. And notice I'm not talking about translators, the publishers. They just don't give into that. So you could even take any page of scripture and reformat it, the way a poet would, and get some sense of how the Bible is poetic. I love this advice from Mary Oliver. If you're intimidated, it's only if you're intimidated, because it's okay to ask both questions. Don't ask people who are intimidated what a poem means, because then they think, oh, I'm not going to do well on this, but ask them how it makes you feel. So anytime a poem intimidates you, just ask yourself how it makes you feel. And sometimes you need to read it aloud. And then you can start to wrestle with, what do you think it means? I want to try and attempt both if possible. And I remember, by the way, reading years ago, I'm pretty sure the quote was from a movie director who he said, I don't like interviewers to ask me, so what's the movie about? Because what he always said was, well, it's about an hour and a half. And they would go, what? And he goes, yeah, it's about an hour and a half, 93 minutes. Yeah, hour and a half. And you could say the same about a poem. Well, it's about 4 stanzas. It's got about 78 words. It's about that long. Obviously, what people mean when they say what's it about is, what is the meaning? And it's okay to wrestle with that, but I would start with, how does it feel? Poets really are trying to say something, but they're trying to offer you an experience. And the good news is her style is narrative. So if you've read poetry in school or since, in which you go, I don't even know what they're trying to do. Well, at least she's usually telling you a story. And her subject matter is everyday life, and especially nature. So here's just an example of the first and last stanza of how I go to the woods. Ordinarily, I go to the woods alone with not a single friend, for they are all smilers and talkers and therefore unsuitable. If you've ever gone to the woods with me, I must love you very much. Now that's incredibly accessible. Now, the fact that it's formatted the way it is could intimidate you because you go, well, no, I didn't realize, why does friend have to go on to the next line? And, and so forth. You have to get used to the rhythms of that. But I mean, she's just telling you a story, and she's even going to address you as a reader. I mean, she's going to say, I must love you very much. And if you have ever gone to the woods with me. All right. So apology out of the way. Remember, apology does not mean I'm apologizing. It means defense, not apologizing. So here's my strategy. I'm going to read several poems and we're going to read them together. And every time I'm going to read it first, just without the words on the screen. You just listen to it, let it wash over you. Then I'll put the words on the screen for you to read and for us to look at, and then we'll have some questions that we can wrestle with. So the first one's called I Wake Close to Morning. And I started with several morning poems because I think, it's the beginning of the day and this is the beginning of our session. And I Wake Close to Morning is the very first one in the entire collection of her biggest collection of poems. And I'll show you that volume later. I wake close to morning. Why do people keep asking to see God's identity papers when the darkness opening into morning is more than enough? Certainly any God might turn away in disgust. Think of Sheba approaching the kingdom of Solomon. Do you think she had to ask, is this the place? Okay, so give you a moment. You can read it aloud to yourself. You can read it silently. Okay, so I'm going to assume you made it through it. And if I have to flip back to it, I can do that. But I'm going to put some questions up. All right, so what are your initial impressions? What just jumped out at you? Anybody? Don't be bashful.
The sun rising and a beautiful morning.
Okay.
The fact that people would ask for the presence of God to be defended.
Okay, good.
I was wondering who Sheba is.
All right. We'll get there. We'll get there. That's good. That's all right.
That that God is both capital and not capital.
Yeah. Any other initial impressions? Okay, so the second question is, what do you make of the analogies? Because poetry loves to use analogies of identity papers and Sheba. So we'll go back to the poem for a second. Let me see if I can get it back. Okay, so the identity papers, she starts by saying, why do people keep asking to see God's identity papers? So that's a metaphor, right? I mean, nobody says I need to see God's identity papers, but you think about movies and passport kinds of stations. Okay, I need to see your papers. Who are you? So she's thinking about people who question the validity of God, the existence of God, benevolence of God, whatever. She uses that analogy. And then for her, as it continues, when the darkness opening the morning, that should have been enough, at least for her it is enough to say, well, there's proof that God is God, right? That darkness gives way to morning. Now, John's comment about Sheba, she's the queen in the Old Testament who comes to see King Solomon. So look at this image. Think of Sheba approaching the kingdom of Solomon. So a queen is come from another nation, is coming to visit the
Well,
kingdom of Solomon. And of course, what do you know about Solomon? He builds the temple, right? And
Well,
the
Mike,
temple, yeah.
yeah, you have to know why she's visiting him and what has she heard about him and what she knows about him and why should she have to ask if he's the richest man in the world, if he's the most brilliant man in the world. She doesn't have to ask who this is, or am I in the right?
Yeah, yeah. It's like there's no way you have to say, oh, well, do you think this is the place, right? I mean, this guy is the richest man. He's built the most extravagant kingdom. There's no way you have to say, well, is this the place? So she's really using these kind of metaphors to get at what for her is kind of self-evident. How could you even have a question? I'm curious, and anybody jump in with anything you want, but how is listening different from reading it? Did that do anything different for you?
You don't know when it's going to end. And then all of a sudden you have a question and it's like, okay, is that over?
Uh-huh.
I think that's why most poets say you should read every poem that you read out loud.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
Yeah.
But, and I also think it's different listening to somebody else read it and reading it yourself.
Yes.
When you do it yourself, you get to pick up and choose your own rhythm. Whereas if somebody's reading it to you, then that person's rhythm is what you get to hear.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the same rhythm.
Right.
Unless you're listening to it on NPR, they all have exactly the same rhythm.
Yeah, that doesn't mean they're right.
No, not at all.
I've even been disappointed by the poet's own readings before.
Yeah.
Which is kind of shocking.
Well, that I was just going to ask, are there any recordings of Mary Oliver reading her own poetry? I've never heard any.
You're going to hear one. I've got.
Oh, okay, great.
In fact, although I have to stop sharing for a moment because I forgot to do one thing in the PowerPoint. Sorry. I forgot because if I don't enable content, it won't work. Okay, hang on. Hopefully you're not too dizzy. Okay, anything else you want to talk about on that one? We'll go to the Why I Wake Early, which is the next one. Okay, so this is Why I Wake Early. And these first ones have a kind of common theme. Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who make the morning and spread it over the fields and into the faces of the tulips and the nodding morning glories and into the windows of even the miserable and the crotchety. Best preacher that ever was, dear star that just happens to be where you are in the universe, to keep us from ever darkness, to ease us with warm touching, to hold us in the great hands of light. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Watch now how I start the day in happiness, in kindness. All right, so there's Why I Wake Early. Okay, if I need to back up, I can. So you can see the questions here. Initial impressions. Why do you think she mentions the sun shining even on the miserable and crotchety? What do you make of the preacher metaphor? Why her stress on the sun's ability to make her want to live in happiness, kindness? What do you want to talk about? What jumps out at you?
You can feel the warmth that she's describing as it's written, the warmth of the sun on your face, and it's, I don't know.
Uh-huh.
Well, and the miserable and crotchety, I mean, that's a grace concept. I mean, I don't know that she's particularly religious, but that's certainly what that is.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Emily Dickinson.
Mhm.
She's been compared to Emily Dickinson, and Emily Dickinson was an influence on her. Her biggest influence is Walt Whitman, by the way.
Hmm.
I think it's interesting that she starts, hello, addressing the sun, and then hello, you who make the morning and spread it over the fields, which is really interesting to me.
I have to
Maybe-
say, this is how I feel every single morning. I mean, every day is a brand new day of wonders. And once I get outside, I'm just not quite in awe, unfortunately, but certainly smiling and starting my prayers and things like that. And it just, that good morning, good morning, good morning, because I say good morning to everybody and wave at all the bus drivers and talk to all the dogs. And yeah, I absolutely identify with this.
And maybe the sun and you are the same person or the same thing.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
I assumed that they were.
What do you think about the best preacher that ever was reference? I thought it was Fred Craddock, but you know,
Nope, it's the morning.
it's the morning, it's the sun, yeah,
It's nature.
it's
Get
nature.
to start all over again. Yes.
Hmm. You don't, I don't, when I read it, I don't see coming the line in happiness and kindness. I mean, I don't find it a disconnect, but it's almost like, I mean, like, I'm not saying I would have done better, not by a long shot, but I almost think I would have expected it to say, watch now how I start the day in wonder and amazement or something. But it's led her to happiness and kindness.
Well, isn't it a corresponding to miserable and crotchety? And so
Uh-huh.
the happiness makes the miserable happier, and the crotchety they become kind.
Assuming that the miserable and crotchety listened to the sermon, right?
When you were reading this, Mike, my first reaction was just smiling, and the gentleness of her words just, it felt very gentle and very happy. It made me feel just happy. I just felt a smile coming on my face before you even got down to the happiness and kindness.
There's no reference to the past in this. The morning is new, everything is new.
I think it describes the experience she has. It's the experience of the sun in my face. She can feel that. And it's similar to, it's the best preacher that ever was. It's the experience of after hearing a good sermon. And now I start my day.
Nice. Y'all are really good at this. Okay. Morning poem. keep our morning theme going. Every morning the world is created. Under the orange sticks of the sun, the heaped ashes of the night turn into leaves again and fasten themselves to the high branches, and the ponds appear like black cloth on which are painted islands of summer lilies. If it is your nature to be happy, you will swim away along the soft trails for hours, your imagination alighting everywhere. And if your spirit carries within it the thorn that is heavier than lead, if it's an all you can do to keep on trudging, there is still somewhere deep within you a beast shouting that the earth is exactly what it wanted. Each pond with its blazing lilies is a prayer heard and answered lavishly every morning, whether or not you've ever dared to be happy, whether or not you have ever dared to pray. So I had to format this one a little different. You go down the column and then go to the middle column and then the third column. So before I turn to the questions that I've put together, what are your own questions, or what's your own kind of feeling for this poem?
The heart of it for me is a prayer heard and answered lavishly every morning.
Okay.
Hopefulness for wherever you are.
Hmm.
The last stanza, whether or not you have ever dared to be happy, whether or not you have ever dared to pray, certainly resonates with me, because I know so many people that are afraid to be happy, afraid to pray. And going back to the first stanza, every morning provides the warmth and the opportunity to overcome your fear.
Thank you. So here's a few questions. Specifically, what do you make of the painting metaphor? Ponds of black cloth on which are painted the lilies. What does the poem offer those who are happy as well as heavy laden? What's the connection with happiness and prayer?
I like the fact that when she talks about the ponds and she says, like the ponds appear with black cloth on which are painted islands, that's a complete thought. I mean, you see that picture, but then she says of summer lilies, and all of a sudden it just explodes and there's something else. And she does that with each stanza. I kind of see a complete thought and then it gets bigger.
Hmm.
She recognizes that most people, or a lot of people, have a thorn that is heavier than lead, that you have something within you, but you keep on trudging. And if you keep on trudging, then you will recognize the beast shouting that the earth is exactly what it wanted. And then you have blazing lilies and a prayer. And God's abundant.
Mm.
That question you had about happiness and prayer, I
Mhm.
think sometimes we forget that prayer isn't just asking, it's also thanking and praising and being grateful.
Mhm.
I guess I would question whether it is the process of prayer that lifts the burden or enlightens the lilies, or in each one of the process of prayer that makes that happen, or the result of prayer.
Mm. Mm. Well, and what is prayer in this case? You know, if your nature is to be happy, everything's fine, right? You're gonna drift along, swim along the soft trails. But if your spirit carries the thorn, there's still something in you that's shouting that the earth's what it wanted. And each pond is a prayer heard and answered. Yeah, it's really interesting to what is the definition of prayer here, and what is that relationship to the happiness?
I think prayer for her is just being in nature. I mean, nature's what feeds her spirit.
Mhm.
And all you have to do is read any of her poetry, and that is the one thing that comes through.
Yeah. We'll see it later too. She actually uses the line about prayer quite a bit, in which she'll say even specifically, I do not know what a prayer is. But I think you're right, Marita. For her, a prayer is it's being in nature. That is the prayer.
Well, I think in that sense that she's a mystic. I mean, she doesn't pray so much in words, but it's an experience with the divine, the liminal.
Yeah, she's definitely a mystic.
Mike, are the stanzas that you show, is that the way she wrote it?
They would just go down one column. I had to put them in 3 columns, but it would be the sentences, each line's broken the way she would break it.
Yeah, and that separates some of the first and last talks of sentence. So that it makes it a little bit harder to read unless you read it.
Yeah. Yeah. Poets make you work at it. Well, I mean, that's part of it. You know, it's not so much, well, why couldn't the world as created be on the same line? It's not that there's genius in separating that, but by doing that, it slows you down, makes you go back, figure out how to read it. If you wrote this thing out in prose, it's only 3 sentences. If you wrote it out in prose, you'd fly through it and you don't get the same effect.
Right.
All right, so here's just a little brief piece in between some poems. So paying attention is the work of poets, no question. And for her, it's a spiritual act. Theologians refer to this as panentheism. There's all kinds of versions of that, but it's the notion that God is in all things. I love in one of her essays, we're not looking at her essays, but on her craft, she identifies the 3 selves, and she does it autobiographically, but I got the feeling that she was kind of saying that this is true of all of us. There's the attentive child, and then and I'm going to skip the middle one, the poet artist. And I think in some ways that third one is a return to the first, albeit with more to say than a child has. But she does talk about in between, like a pilot. If you get on a plane to fly across the country, well, the pilot probably ought to pay attention, you know, can't be daydreaming and so forth. I mean, they're flying a jet with a couple hundred people on board, and maybe there's an attentive child on board who can just look out the window And the poet who maybe sees something in the middle of those clouds that speaks to him or her, but this social self, and in a way, it kind of goes back to what we were doing about left brain and right brain, that to do poetry is to put on hold for a moment all of the duties that you have as the grown-up adult, that middle thing, that social self that has to relate to people, that has to dot, their I's and cross their T's and put punctuation the way it's supposed to be. Poets say, okay, let's get out of that brain for a minute. Let's just play. Let's go back to being the child. So again, it's just kind of a reminder that when you do poetry, it's slowing down. And the little quote there on the left is from her. Attention is the beginning of devotion. So she has a poem called Praying. I'm going to read that one next. I can find it here in the midst of all my bookmarks. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak.
I like this one the best of all we've read.
How come?
Damn, Mike, that's a tough question.
Well, see, you may not know the answer because remember, it's about how it makes you feel.
Yeah,
So it's this one makes you feel something that you didn't feel in the others.
that's right.
And that's okay. You don't have to know an answer.
Makes you feel like maybe you're smart enough to get this stuff after all.
Oh, now that's optimistic.
Anyone else first impressions?
It makes me think of the elders, when you're writing your prayer at the elders table and it says, don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but a doorway. That was one thing that came to my mind.
I appreciate the fact that she sees beauty in iris and also a vacant lot, and you have a picture of dandelions there. So dandelions can have beauty also.
Mm-hmm.
Ask any young child that brings you a handful with great glee.
This
The
one
last-
actually, oh, go ahead.
Say, Hannah, the last line is especially powerful to me. The doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak.
What I was going to say is this poem made me feel like maybe in my reflection times, after my centering prayer, I might want to try writing a little poetry. It made me feel like if you don't get all caught up in trying to do it right or being fancy or being good enough, it could be a really meaningful thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it could.
I'll tell you what I do, which is a little bit odd, but every night after I finish writing the drivel that goes into my journal, I do a haiku about something that happened or I saw or whatever that day. And even just having to do the 5-7-5 syllables makes me think about what words work in there and how I want that to feel to me, to see if it doesn't give me the feeling that I had at the time. And that's fun. That, you know, only takes a few minutes, and it's a good exercise and makes you use your brain a little bit. So food for thought.
Yeah. So I just had, you know, obvious questions. How can weeds in a vacant lot or small stones carry the same impact as seeing the blue iris? Why her stress that whatever words we patch together not be considered a contest. I like whoever made that comment. I think it was Annie. I've had a lot of elders, especially when we've been submitting them via email, say, feel free to make some edits and send me back suggestions. But also that voice that might speak. That's an interesting line, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. This morning when I was walking the dog, we walk along a wide path, and there are some big stone or cement squares that have little oblong pieces cut out for some reason. And under all of that cement, the grass has managed to find a way to come up under those little tiny pieces. That just made me smile. I like the thought that it kept working, even though it looked like there wasn't a chance in hell that it was going to get through under that cement, but it managed.
Well, there's your haiku for tonight, I guess.
And it is.
Anyone else on the poem Praying?
The idea that she's asking us, if she's entitling this praying, and she's asking us to enter a silence, but also to listen to another voice, to me, that's intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be wherever you are. It doesn't have to be in a specific place with a grand view.
Mm-hmm. And just patch a few words together. Yeah. All right. So here's one called Some Questions You Might Ask. Is the soul solid like iron, or is it tender and breakable like the wings of a moth in the beak of the owl? Who has it and who doesn't? I keep looking around me. The face of the moose is as sad as the face of Jesus. The swan opens her white wings slowly. In the fall, the black bear carries leaves into the darkness. One question leads to another. Does it have a shape like an iceberg, like the eye of a hummingbird? Does it have one lung like the snake and the scallop? Why should I have it and not the anteater who loves her children? Why should I have it and not the camel? Come to think of it, what about the maple trees? What about the blue iris? What about all the little stones sitting alone in the moonlight? What about roses and lemons and their shining leaves? What about the grass?
There's this tree. There's this tree near our house, and it's really not pretty like some trees are. And it's almost stopped making cones, you know, pine cones, pine tree. And so somebody that I'm really close to has said, that tree needs to go. And I cannot tell you why I don't want that tree to go. It's everything that you think of when a tree is dying or unattractive or whatever.
Mm.
And I thought of that tree when I was reading this.
Mm.
There are a lot of questions in this poem,
Yes, there are.
lots of question marks.
What's this? It says some questions you might ask, but there's really one main question being asked, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe two.
Yeah, maybe two.
Soul, and where does the soul live?
What's it like? Who has one?
To me, she's pointing out the universality of us and nature and every creation that's ever made, and all the things that we really have in common.
Mm-hmm. I think
When you realize that even plants communicate with one another, which I found astounding, and then thought, why didn't I already know that? Yeah, I certainly, for one, think everything has a soul.
Why do you think she does the face of the moose is as sad as the face of Jesus? What do you make of that line?
That's one of my favorite lines in there. And as soon as she said that, I thought, of course. Yeah. Even the one in my family's family room above the mantle has a sad face.
Is it a moose or Jesus?
Yeah, no. We just have the moose's head above the mantle. We have Jesus everywhere else. How's that?
There aren't a whole lot of pictures of Jesus smiling.
Not very many. You know, what I thought was just fascinating is she's got this list of, you know, why should I have it? And why should I? But it's not, you know, and like, can't roses have a soul, etc. But when she does the anteater who loves her children, isn't that just, I don't know, just so cute to me.
The anteater line just touched, that's my favorite. And, you know, they say that love isn't just a feeling, it's your action, you know, you act out your love. And I mean, an anteater, I don't know if her heart goes pitter patter when she looks at her babies, but she sure does take care of them. I love that line.
Most of us had a Sunday school teacher who in his or her left brain told us that only people have a soul, and it's you know, eternal, and everything else is physical and temporal. And but if you go back to the poet as child, poets don't care about that. Poets are not theologians. They're more about this panentheism, God in all things.
And if you've ever been a child that loved an animal, then you know that animals have souls.
Mm-hmm. You notice how many times the blue iris comes up? I think it must be her favorite. It really comes up a lot in her poetry. Anyone else? Well, we covered all the. Okay, so just another little interlude here. I don't know if you know this, but the word poem, which we use in English, comes from the Greek verb to make, or from the noun something made. And so it's an interesting term that we've used. We just took a Greek word and made an English word out of it. But a poem is a thing that's been made, it's been built, so the way a builder makes a house or a landscaper makes a garden. So I did think, since you asked, I think Marilyn asked, that we would listen to her reading one. And this one is The Summer Day.
The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
So I reprinted it there for you if you need a moment, but I'm just curious, what was your initial response just hearing her read?
She's so gentle the way she reads her poetry.
There's nothing boastful at all about her. She's very humble. And that last line is one of her most famous, of course, and one of my favorites.
Yeah, Carla and I have both probably used that as a quote at the beginning of a worship service or on a bulletin.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carla used it really recently, actually. It's interesting that last question describes, it not only asks what do you plan to do, but it describes your life as wild and precious. What do you make of the, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention.
Mike? I think that goes back to, I don't think she prays in the way that most folks typically think about prayer. I think for her, prayer is being out in nature and enjoying communing with God via nature.
Mike, I'm curious, do you know what denomination she was brought up in?
I think, if I remember right, and not really brought up in, but I think it was Methodist.
Methodist, okay. Because many times your feelings about the things she's talking about, the things you were taught when your early childhood at church kind of conflict with these things or add to it. So I was wondering, what basis she had in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Marita's comment about prayer, I don't know what a prayer is and how to pay attention. Most of us think of prayer as transactional,
Mhm.
even if we're not going to just ask for stuff. We just think of it as a transaction, as opposed to the notion of communing. If you get in the car with your best friend on a road trip, the two of you are going to, if we can use this term, the two of you are going to pray to each other
Mhm.
the whole time. If you really understand the meaning of the word, you're going to talk back and forth, and you're going to be comfortable with silence, and you're going to have a conversation, and that would be closer to what the word really means.
Right, right.
And she uses, to pay attention, and then she uses prayer kind of words, to fall down, to kneel down,
Mhm.
be idle.
I have to wonder if she was sent outside because of what was going on in her home.
Oh yeah, she definitely was. She said she was escaping.
Yeah.
But then of course she was escaping home, but she was escaping school. I mean,
Mhm.
she just was very much a nature person from the
Mhm.
get-go.
Yeah.
Okay, last chance. I'm going to move on. All right. So here's one called Logos. See if I can get to it. Why wonder about the loaves and the fishes? If you say the right words, the wine expands. If you say them with love and the felt ferocity of that love and the felt necessity of that love, the fish explode into many. Imagine him speaking, and don't worry about what is reality or what is plain or what is mysterious. If you were there, it was all those things. If you can imagine it, it is all those things. Eat, drink, be happy, accept the miracle, accept too each spoken word spoken with love. How's that one make you feel?
The last part reminds me of what we say before communion at the communion table.
Yeah, we definitely have a communion image going, don't we? Well, here's some questions, or here's the poem itself. Sorry, I'll let you look at it again. So it's interesting that you start with the loaves and the fish story, which happens in the wilderness. But then you get, if you say the right words, the wine expands, which kind of brings up a kind of wedding at Cana, which isn't out in the wilderness. It also reminds me of a lot of traditions, not ours, but a lot of Christian traditions. You have to say the right words at communion table. And I mean, literally, you have to say the right words. It's, by the way, it's where the phrase hocus pocus comes from, because that comes from the Latin. It's a play on words. This is my body. And they made them into hocus pocus. And it was the idea that there's magic in saying the right words. And in the traditions that go by the book, and this would be Episcopal, Roman Catholic, Methodist, Lutheran in particular, you have to say this formula. And you also have to be credentialed to say this formula. Not anybody can say it. I can't say it. I'm not in that tradition, so I'm not qualified. But for her, it's if you say them with love. And then, of course, the fish explode into many, which is really interesting because in the story, it's the bread that multiplies, right? You don't even hear about the fish.
Well, and see, I think some of what she's saying is you don't have to take any of it literally. You just have to go with the mystery, and you have to get the general meaning of it, but you need to not get caught up in some of the details.
Yeah, and boy, churches, traditions have wrestled over this. I mean, in some ways, nothing has divided Christianity more than the meaning of it. I mean, the Reformation was fought over it. All right, I'm going to keep moving us along because I realize we're going a little long. But as with other saints of our time, I hope Mary Oliver can be a companion on your journey. And I just put two possibilities for you. Devotions is the bigger one. It might be softback now, but it's bigger, more expensive. Or the briefer collection, New and Selected Poems. You can't go wrong with any Mary Oliver collections of poetry, but I just listed these two. There's also, if you're interested in kind of getting more into poetry, Hirsch's book, How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with It, is really helpful. And lots of good examples there. So here's just a brief overview. We're through with Monday night classes for the spring, but Backyard Bash on Wednesday evenings in June and July. It's actually not the very first week of June, but starting the 9th, we're going to have 8 Wednesdays in a row. And there is going to be an adult offering besides stuff for kids and families and food trucks, etc. So you can be looking for that. Fall Monday night classes will be back. And guess what? They'll be in person. I can't believe it. They'll be in person. And I'll bring some guest speakers as well as me doing some things. Leslie Holt is going to bring back, hopefully this September through May, a disciple Bible study. And it's really a transformative experience for a lot of people. So you can contact her if you're interested, or contact me. And then right now, the plan is that I will offer Life Worth Living every January. And we'll see if it's any more often, but it would be virtual because we have such a wide reach. Like right now, I have in my small group for the spring session, I have like 10 people in my group, and I think 5 of them are thousands of miles away. So anyway, you can stay tuned for that. And then just as a little bonus, I want to read you 2 of my favorites. This one's called The Sun. Have you ever seen anything in your life more wonderful than the way the sun every evening, relaxed and easy, floats toward the horizon and into the clouds or the hills or the rumpled sea and is gone? And how it slides again out of the blackness every morning on the other side of the world, like a red flower streaming upward on its heavenly oils, say on a morning in early summer at its perfect imperial distance. And have you ever felt for anything such wild love? Do you think there is anywhere in any language a word billowing enough for the pleasure that fills you as the sun reaches out, as it warms you, as you stand there empty-handed? Or have you too turned from this world? Or have you too gone crazy for power, for things? And then I'm pretty sure, this is my favorite, Mary Oliver, Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Like an amen is in order there. Well, thanks for joining. I hope
you.
that it was meaningful to the poets, and I hope that those who are a little bit allergic to poetry are a little less allergic, that your heart was strangely warmed, as they say.